Hello and welcome to the European Dialogue, a podcast brought to you by the EU Values Jean Monnet Network, where we examine the most pressing global issues with leading experts to explore the forces shaping our world today. I'm Emily Jones and I'm delighted to have you with us. My guest today is Professor Elaine Fahey, a leading scholar in EU law and global governance. Elaine is based at the City Law School of City St George's at the University of London, where she serves as a Professor of EU law. She also co-convenes the Institute for the Study of European Law and has held visiting positions at institutions across Europe, the United States and Asia, as well as serving as a legal barrister in Ireland. Today she joins us with her academic hat on to talk about her research on the EU's role in global governance, transatlantic relations and digital regulation, with a particular focus on the EU-US cybersecurity approaches. So stay tuned and be sure to check out the podcast description for all the links and information in this podcast. Elaine, a huge welcome to the European Dialogue. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Good afternoon. Hi, Emily.
So, okay, let's begin. Let's start with the big picture. How would you describe the current relationship between Europe and the US when it comes to cybersecurity?
So this is the million-dollar question or the million-euro question. It is very difficult at this moment in time between the administration shifts to really evaluate it. I think I certainly would struggle to. However, it's not unusual historically. There have been many shifts. So where we are, I think, was that we have arrived at a point where there was considerable convergence, despite many reasons for there not to be so. And cybersecurity has been a very interesting topic. There's a lot of questions that emerged as to cyber defense or cyber policy or its links to data privacy and trade. But I would say it probably does look like there's some extraordinary divergences taking place. But I think time will tell as to how this will, how much this is the case. But having said that, cybersecurity cooperation has had tremendous international collaboration across administrations. So it's not what you think, which is often the case with transatlantic relations. It's just not what people expect it to do. It isn't, certain political administrations tend to lend a particular view to what you might say it should be the outcome, but it's not an easy topic because it reaches in so many different directions.
Indeed. Well, time will tell, as you say. I suppose, like many aspects of the EU-US relationship right now, it's pretty fast moving, and who knows, even by the time we probably put this podcast out, what it could look like. So let's turn now to your recent article titled The Evolution of EU-US Cybersecurity Law and Policy, which was published last year in 2024. In this article, you write about how the focus has shifted from fighting online crime to broader cybersecurity concerns. Could you tell us about why this shift happened and really what that means for how Europe approaches digital threats?
Yeah, absolutely. One basic point is that society is increasingly digitalized on either side of the Atlantic, and there are more things or entities to regulate. There's more ways in which cyber issues matter to people. Cyber necessitates more regulation. Things from the Internet of Things. You can't buy a child's toy or a sports watch without having to sign up for goods and services and so on. There are more criminal activities engaged in internet actions. There are more consumers conducting their ordinary lives. So on either side of the Atlantic, much has taken place, showing a widening of the subjects and objects of regulation. And I found it interesting to write this particular paper. It was a project that was going on for several years with a whole variety of transatlantic scholars, and it is just a topic that shows how much holistic, comprehensive regulation is very difficult of a topic that just continues to spiral or to burgeon in terms of its content. So there are very different approaches to what the EU and US do as to cybersecurity, but they both have faced this digitalization of society and this more of an interest in cybersecurity generally across the Atlantic.
Right, yeah, for sure. Both Europe and the US face the same challenges then with the kind of growing need and use of quote, cyber, whether consumers or criminal, as you mentioned there a couple of ways. But what differences do we see in the two regions' approaches to regulation of cyber? Are they cooperating in terms of regulation?
Yeah, this is a really important question on what specifically is the actual difference between the EU and US. And in general, the EU has shifted towards a much more internal market or market-based understanding of cybersecurity, and the US has tended to be much more sectoral, and the EU has tended to have much more regulation and is less interested in criminalizing activities, is much more interested in the scope of the Internet of Things, is much, has much more privacy or higher standards. So it looks on, I think, on a very general level that there's a lot more alignment in ideas that all cyber issues are not just about cybercrime. Cybercrime isn't very, a useful term on either side of the Atlantic. It's much more gone towards cybersecurity, but that has meant that there are still lots of nuances coming from those very different starting points.
That sounds like a very interesting comparison, and also your observations there of the alignment in the two approaches as well, at least in terms of what cybersecurity can encompass. So, in addition to this term cybersecurity, we are also, at least in Europe, hearing this term digital sovereignty banded around quite a lot. Could you tell us what this really means in practice?
Yeah, so the question of digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty has become very much a goal of EU policy making in the last number of years, and has many different understandings. We're not 100% clear what it means, how it relates to industrial policy, how it relates to internal market, but it has been used for a lot more offensive or protectionist, defensive types of regulations. But it still is, probably is a lot more about the internal market, whereas defend forward is much more of an aggressive defense, warlike approach, as it were, that manifested in the US several years ago, and or sorry, I should say many years ago, and they, they're interesting in how they align, or they do. I mean, there's also whole debates on open strategic autonomy, digital strategic autonomy, and what the EU's action should be. Things like everything from cloud computing to supply chains and so on. Where can the EU, as an entity that's very good at regulation but not as good at leading in technologies and being an industrial power in emerging technologies, how can that propel it forward? And I just thought it was an interesting comparison to look at the terms digital sovereignty, defend forward, how they relate, how they show different approaches to international law, who's been pushing them, where they, how executive dominant they tend to be. And I just thought they were interesting in terms of the parallels that are there. They mean very different things to very, different people. But Europe has become a lot more defensive in how it speaks about its ambitions, its place in the world, its activeness. And yeah, I just thought there were interesting parallels there. And maybe all readers mightn't agree with me, or listeners mightn't think that they are even suitable. But there's a lot there about cyber issues and about across the US administrations the need for the US to adopt this very particular approaches to international law. And I don't go into that much in the article, but I think there's a lot of very interesting scholarship from international scholars in the US on cyber issues that are worth having a look at.
Yes, thank you for that. Your research is super interesting. I really encourage our listeners to check out Elaine's mentioned article there to dive a little deeper into those differences and that comparison between the internal market versus defend forward approaches that we see between the EU and the US. You may also like to check out the European Union Studies Association, or the EUSA, for some other research on transatlantic relations as well. Both links you will be able to find in the podcast description. So now let's move on to talk about a very live topic with the brewing trade war between the US and China. This is against a backdrop of lots of concerns from Europe as well on the fast-moving technology coming from Asia. Would you say these concerns of this technology have brought the EU and US closer together when it comes to cybersecurity?
I'm smiling because I think this is the million dollar question at the moment. What is everyone's approach to China seems to be so profoundly important. I think there was a major cooperation between the EU and US recently called the Trade and Technology Council, and there China really seemed to unite them. That the EU had has different standards on privacy and data regulation, the DSA, the DMA data. It has so much stuff that the US doesn't have to the same extent, but they seem to be very much united on this idea of trade and technology needing to be an issue to consider, how to oppose China or how to engage with China or not, and so on. Whereas when it comes to cybersecurity, it looks so different. I think it is hugely the same issue that China is. For example, in cybercrime or at UN level or the Council of Europe, it seems to be in the background motivating a lot of major international developments, international organization developments. So this obviously so much happening about TikTok, the 5G side of things and security, and I think it remains to be seen what the outcome of this. But I think China is a very good starting point to ask. What happened in trade and technology, what happened in cybersecurity, and did the central positioning of China become so useful or not?
I'm curious that trade and technology is kind of bundled together, and from what you're saying, prioritized, but yet cybersecurity sits apart from that. Well, okay, it's an area for us to watch then, I'm sure. And then talking of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, this brings me nicely onto another article from your research that caught our attention. It's titled The TTC Model of Democratic Leadership. Again, listeners, it will be in the description. And in this article, Elaine, you look at how digital policy is becoming a form of diplomacy. Can you explain briefly the TTC acronym there a little bit more, and also how you think it has shaped cooperation?
Yeah, sure. So the acronyms are a great way to understand anything that the EU does, and the TTC was one of two types of TTC, a Trade and Technology Council. The EU has another one with India, and I suppose I became quite alarmed by this, seeing how much soft law was involved in it. And this pivot away from international institutions, this way, pivot away from binding law. I still am very concerned by it. And I just think it was a very interesting thing to study how much law was in it and how little law came out of it and how it's just very law light. And I think it's not going to be something that will feature ever again, or, it's exhausting looking at it. And diplomacy is, many people would say transatlantic relations are dead as we know it, and they don't exist. And I think diplomacy is, has a very difficult place in all of this. And I think it was difficult, if I understand it right, talking to some of the civil servants involved, how exhausting it is to prepare these huge ministerial meetings several times a year between these very high level politicians, and how very little coming from it. So that's kind of what I thought of it, that it was just something interesting to study that was likely to die a death, but of more of academic value than of any political or policy value for now. So remains to be seen.
Oh, sounds like some pretty disappointing observations there of the TTC. Sometimes there is a place for soft law, but perhaps this just wasn't the arena for it, and certainly not the subject matter. In this research, you do mention how civil society and parliaments are often left out of those transatlantic cybersecurity discussions as well. Why is that a concern? I mean, we can probably all guess, but especially from a European democratic values perspective, why is that so concerning?
Yeah. So another very big question. Definitely, what I suppose we can start from the point of view that transatlantic relations. What is it? It is a huge number of entities, people, actors, that are businesses, policymakers, whatever, that are involved in, sometimes global issues, sometimes more esoteric, sometimes, it's a very big thing to study. And historically, there really haven't been that many, institutions. And in data privacy, we've seen some really interesting developments, like a data privacy court. I would say cybersecurity it is a difficult one because the EU has, for example, put a lot of work into its internal market act, or internal market-based Cybersecurity Act. It has, done some very interesting work with the US on sanctions, cyber sanctions. So would we say that civil society departments would be left out of that? No, I think that's a hard claim to make. On the international side of things, I think some very interesting work is going on as to cybersecurity. There's lots of, efforts to bring on board civil society, and I'm not sure it's obvious to say that there's a transatlantic problem. I think it's complex lawmaking, and it's really led by, the international cooperation has very difficult parallels with what's happening across between the EU and US. On trade and technology, I was definitely very upset personally by how much the European Parliament was left out of the TTC, how far it is from the transatlantic legislative dialogue, how civil society felt really part of the TTC. There was loads of Zoom working groups or whatever, but very difficult to understand what was going on. I was part of those working groups as well. Really, really non-transparent. I'm not sure, cybersecurity has those problems, partly because there's a lot less law. But I think it will be interesting to see what happens going forward, because in the last while, there's been tremendous effort to bring on board civil society and parliaments into transatlantic discussions, even on things that weren't successful, for example, the TTC, or things that were very successful, for example, the transatlantic privacy framework developments in the wake of the Schrems decision. So, so that I would maybe disagree and say maybe cybersecurity is a bit different. And then from the point of view of European democratic values, I think cybersecurity is a very important development, because our lives are increasingly framed by the term cyber, and yet there's massive misunderstandings across international organizations, across countries, regions, all over the world, and what these terms mean. Some people say cybersecurity, all one word. Some people say cyber and security separately. Some people say cyber and might sound like a kind of silly pedantic thing, but these things matter, how you put the terms together or you don't. And some people very confidently say, crime is things that happen in the past, and security is the future. So I'm not sure there is a united enough just conceptual framework on what these terms are, never mind as to the democratic values. But I think going forward, these are definitely the questions to continue to consider.
Indeed. So then our final question for you today, and it is also related to thinking where cybersecurity could go in the future. What do you think are the biggest opportunities or risks for deeper EU and US cooperation in this area? And if you could give one piece of advice to policymakers, what would that be?
Sure. So in terms of the risks of EU-US cooperation on cybersecurity, I think at international level, the EU and US have always been in very different camps at international level to Russia and China. And new geopolitical shifts or alterations in particular in understandings of the values of democracy and the support for multilateralism, I think those are the most profound ones, on which camp the cyber issues and the place of the state in cyber issues. I think also debates as to data privacy have schismed so much. There's so many disparate views across the regions, and even in the very very warm environment, as it were, of the EU-US Biden administration relations, there still was no effort to adopt a wholesale version of data privacy, where there was no effort to have a federal regulation and so on. So these broader things matter. I think another risk has to be the place of the Council of Europe, and the US has been an unfailing supporter of all things European in so many different directions there. And to me, that would be one really important basic point, that the US, not even a member of the Council of Europe, has in fact led so many key cyber-related initiatives. So then, in terms of opportunities for cooperation, I would say that there certainly is very much a consumer-led demand and business-led demand for greater privacy and data regulation. There are more companies engaging in cyber regulation. The Internet of Things is the same. You have a huge alignment of big tech on the need for good and robust, regulation or standards. I think that AI issues have shown how there's tremendous capacity for the EU and US to align their opinions, their views, their taxonomies of the G20 or the OECD, who knows. And even if those developments are not successful, they still show that the capacity to think big and across organizations really matters. There was some very interesting work done, NIST in the US learning from the EU's AI board, for example. And cybersecurity will have an increasingly broad understanding in both contexts on account of the digitalization transition. Policymakers, I think, need to consider the place of institutions more thoughtfully on the robustness of enforcement and regulation, which might sound very trite, but cybersecurity is often soft law based, or it has been historically, keeping lawyers and legal terms out of the picture. And we have seen how consumers and businesses often are not well served so much by a morass of soft law. And that's not to say to full-scale regulation of everything is possible, but just light touch developments tend not to be particularly successful. I think also policymakers need to be very concerned about the shift in digital partnerships, even by entities such as the EU. We've seen also with the US, this movements away from trade agreements and so on towards soft law-based partnerships, and how cybersecurity issues have tended to increasingly be falling into bits of trade agreements or falling into strategic partnerships, but are may be better served in this context. I think the relationship with cyber sanctions is something that I would like policymakers to be a bit more nuanced about. Having very aggressive, successful common foreign and security policy regulations looks very different to the internal market. It's quite a strange package of you're using this very thin legal basis on the one side to regulate everything about cybersecurity, and then it's this extremely bazooka approach, if you like, on the other side. And why is that the case, that there isn't more competence as to cybersecurity issues, basic definitions? Should cybersecurity be much more in the EU treaties? Are policymakers really well served by not enough law, not enough I suppose an EU law-based answer to policymakers would also be the place of institutions enforcement, as to the CFSP continues to be a huge challenge as to fundamental rights and so on. And that's obviously something that is in the background to all of this. And I think sanctions are somewhat well served, but I think it's a broader question about the future of external relations law in a world where digital issues are very much soft law, and that people are not well served by those nuances.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm afraid that is all we have time for, but a huge thanks on behalf of the EU Values Network for your time and your expertise today. We've really enjoyed learning from you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for the fantastic questions, and for very thoughtfully engaging with so much work. It's really nice to do this. My first ever podcast, so thank you so much.
We're very happy to have you. And listeners, tell us what you think. You can find all the information mentioned in today's episode in the podcast description, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and across our social media as well. We would really value your feedback. Thank you very much for listening.